All right, 2020, we are back in action. I hope when you guys took your break and ate the food, I hope you guys kind of like thought in your head what's going on, what enzymes are acting in my food, what's being released. I think if you think about that, when you eat, kind of like use, what you learn in medical school and apply it to daily life, it will definitely help you, master these topics. All right, so let's continue. And now we're going down the GI system, right? We talked about the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the little bit of the duodenum. Let's talk about the pancreas, right? So far, all we talked about the pancreas is that secretin, which is released by what cells? That's right, the S cells. And where are those S cells? In the duodenum. And what makes them release secretin? That's right, acid, right? And what does secretin do? Well, it tells the pancreas to secrete what? Bicarb, right? Bicarb. So the pancreas secretes bicarb with respect to secretin, but it also secretes pancreatic enzymes, right? And we mentioned that one of the guys that are responsible for the pancreas secreting its pancreatic enzymes is CCK, right? As I said, CCK is pro-digestive. It's gonna tell the gallbladder to contract, and it's also going to tell the pancreas to secrete its pancreatic enzymes. And you guys know that the pancreas, which is like this really like fatty looking organ, is the pancreatic duct is attached to the common bile duct, right? And then you have the gallbladder over here. Then you have the common hepatic duct here, which gives you the right and left hepatic duct, which goes inside of the liver, right? So this bile duct attaches to the pancreatic duct, and they both coincide the duodenum via the sphincter of Oddi. So obviously, if CCK is telling the gallbladder to contract, right, to secrete bile, and is telling the pancreas to secrete its pancreatic enzymes as well, it's gonna tell the sphincter of Oddi to open up, aka relax, right? So two major players on the pancreas, secretin and CCK, definitely know what secretes secretin, where are those cells located, what makes them, and the same thing for CCK. All right, so let's talk a little bit about that pancreatic juice that remember I said that bicarbonate is secreted in response to secretin. We call that pancreatic juice. So what exactly is the composition of that pancreatic juice with respect to a high flow rate and a low rate, right? So in the high rate, we see that most of it is bicarb, right? Now in the low rate, actually that bicarb tends to kind of go back into the cell, and chloride actually gets an opportunity to come out. The reason is you have this negative charge here, right? So as that negative charge is going into the cell, you have to replace it, and you replace it with chloride ion. Um, this is just a terrible picture of how it works. We could this is a better picture that I found online. Basically, the reaction is the same as is similar to that of gastric acid secretion, right? We have carbon dioxide, right, goes inside the pancreatic cell. The carbon dioxide joins with water, and what does that become? Carbonic acid, right? And then what does the carbonic acid become? The carbonic acid gives you one bicarb and one hydrogen ion. Now the bicarb ion is going to be the one that gets secreted into the lumen, right, of the duodenum. And in exchange for one bicarb ion, you're going to get one chloride ion, and that's going to be through this bicarb chloride antiporter, right? Very similar, very similar. You guys remember the parietal cell had that hydrogen ion potassium ATPase pump, right? This is the same thing, except this case we're talking about bicarb and chloride ion, right? And then this one too has chloride ion channels that are always open, that are leaking out chloride ion, and we also have sodium and hydrogen involved over here. You have this guy over here. The money is here. This is where the money is, right? So all of this is telling you that potassium and sodium are always being excreted and reabsorbed. So their concentration really doesn't matter. The money is here. The money is with the chloride concentration and the bicarb concentration with respect to the pancreatic juice. And what do I mean by that? If we look at this graph right here, we can look at the secretory rate. We see that when there is a high normal secretory rate, we see that the major composition of this pancreatic juice has bicarb in it, therefore causing elevated pH, right? Alkaline. Now, if we look at where the pancreatic juice is really, really low, we can see that the bicarb concentration goes down, and we can see that the chloride concentration goes up. So then that means if we were to trace this up, we can see that pancreatic juice at a low flow rate actually has more chloride ion and it has less bicarb. It's good to know. Good to know there. Um, pancreatic enzymes, right? We keep talking about pancreatic enzyme, pancreatic enzymes. What enzymes are these? The major player here, well, you have two major players, right? One of them is amylase, right? I like I said that up until then you have oral amylase, right? So salivary amylase, which is doing some destruction of your lipids, your carbs, right? And then you get to the pancreas, and you have pancreatic amylase, which is a big player there. One thing you guys have to know is this guy right here, trypsinogen. Trypsinogen. Doesn't that sound familiar? Yeah, it sounds like pepsinogen, right? So what does that mean? That means it's a zymogen. What is a zymogen? A zymogen is the inactive form of a enzyme that needs to be cleaved in order for it to become active. Okay, so and then you have other enzymes, chymotrypsinogen, procarboxypeptidase A, procarboxypeptidase B. So what I'm trying to say here is this, is that the trypsinogen, right? If we take this trypsinogen, and activate it, it becomes trypsin enzyme, right? And this trypsin enzyme goes around cleaving proteins and stuff like that. Now, what you want to know is what activates trypsinogen, what cleaves it so it can become its active form. And the thing that does that is called enterokinase. Enterokinase. What is enterokinase? Enterokinase is a brush border enzyme. You guys remember that in the small intestine you have like this villi and they have cilia and stuff like that. So we call that the brush border, right? So these brush borders have enzymes on them, and these enzymes are the ones that act on trypsinogen to convert it from trypsinogen to trypsin, right? Now, what you guys want to know is, what does trypsin do? This is a very high yield topic here. Trypsin actually goes around and activates all these other pancreatic enzymes. So trypsin cleaves chymotrypsinogen and converts it into chymotrypsin. Trypsin cleaves procarboxypeptidase A and turns it into carboxypeptidase A. And the same thing for procarboxypeptidase B. Furthermore, trypsin itself also goes around and cleaves other trypsinogens into trypsin. So you can see how trypsin is very important, because these other enzymes cannot be activated without trypsin activating them. And here's how step one breaks it down, right? Um, so here's how step one breaks it down. Like I said about alpha amylase is secreted by the pancreas. The starch carbohydrate digestion. You also have lipases, right? Proteases, right? Proteases is what we're talking about here. You have a bunch, but they all start out. You have trypsin, chymotrypsin, elastase, carboxypeptidases, right? Now, what it's saying here is that they start off as proenzymes, aka zymogens, right? And the main player is this guy right here, trypsinogen. Trypsinogen gets converted into trypsin, right? And once it gets converted into trypsin, it goes around and cleaves additional trypsinogen and converts it into trypsin. And it also activates other proenzymes. What are those other proenzymes? That was chymotrypsinogen, proelastase, and the procarboxypeptidases, right? And what you guys want to know is what converts the trypsinogen to trypsin in the first place. And that's going to be your enterokinase or enteropeptidase, right? Your brush border enzymes on the duodenal and jejunum. So we talked about CCK, right? We kept saying that, CCK causes the gallbladder to contract, right? CCK causes sphincter of Oddi to relax. How does it do that? How does it do that? It does that via the vagus nerve, right? So at the duodenum, you have vagal afferents, right? And these CCK, these eye cells, remember the cells that are secreting CCK are the eye cells. They're going to secrete CCK, and that CCK is going to bind to these afferent neurons, and it's going to send this signal to the brain that, hey, there's CCK in your GI, and the brain's going to say, okay, then that means that I have to send a signal to the gallbladder to contract, right? And we know that an excitatory neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, and over here it's going to tell the sphincter of Oddi to relax, and we know that our inhibitory motor molecules are vasoactive intestinal peptide and nitric oxide, right? And this is just what he has it as CCK. Like I said, okay, CCK is over here, right? Cholecystokinin, right? What activates CCK? What tells CCK? What tells the eye cells to secrete CCK? That's going to be fat and amino acids, right? Where is CCK? Duodenum, jejunum, ileum. What does CCK do? Gallbladder contraction, right? And if the gallbladder contracts, if you're squeezing the tube of toothpaste and the cap is closed, what's the point of that, right? You have to open the cap of toothpaste and squeeze the toothpaste out. Therefore, it's going to relax the sphincter of Oddi. It's also going to tell the pancreas to secrete its enzymes, right? We talked about what those enzymes are, trypsinogen, all those kind of things. It's going to tell, yeah, that's basically that's what you got to know about that. And you just hear how first aid has it. First aid has it more simpler. Like I said, cholecystokinin, CCK, who secretes it? The eye cells. Where are these eye cells? In the duodenum, jejunum. What do? They tell the pancreas to secrete its enzymes. They tell the gallbladder to contract, and they relax the sphincter of Oddi. What activates them? Fatty acids and amino acids. Boom. Um, and then they act via neuromuscarinic pathways, right? Dr. Littleton has a really great picture here of exactly how that works. All right. And then this is something that he has. This is like some PhD stuff. You really don't have to know this for step one. But you could, the theory is kind of the same, right? You have things that turn things on. Then you obviously are going to have molecules to turn things off. And the molecules that are responsible for really turning things off in the pancreas is the pancreatic polypeptide, right? That's the feedback modulator of these vagal afferents to the pancreas. So once to a certain point, this pancreatic polypeptide gets secreted, and it reaches the brain, and then the brain is going to say, okay, this pancreatic polypeptide is going to inhibit these vagal efferents and stop the vagus nerve from doing what it wants to do, which is secrete insulin and secrete its juices. This is very high yield here. Remember I talked about the GI, these K cells, right? I said K cells secrete GIP. GIP has a bunch of different aliases, but I like to think of GIP as the glucose dependent insulinotropic peptide. So what does it do? It depends on glucose, right? So when glucose reaches these K cells, these K cells sense this glucose and they dump out GIP. They dump out GIP into the bloodstream, right? We call that endocrine, right? This GIP goes into circulation and it reaches the pancreas, right? It reaches these islets of Langerhans, right? And the islets of Langerhans contain insulin. So when this GIP reaches these islets of Langerhans, they're going to dump out insulin into the blood. Insulin's going to go everywhere, and it's going to take molecules of glucose into the cells to use it for energy, right? Now, what you guys want to know is why. So why do we give glucose to diabetics who are having diabetic attacks? Why do we give them oral glucose instead of giving them, IV glucose? Why do we do that? Well, the reason is this. This is the reason is that these K cells, their potential to secrete insulin is very, very high if you give someone oral glucose compared to giving them IV glucose, right? If you give someone IV glucose, that means the glucose bypasses these K cells, right? If you give glucose straight into the bloodstream, then you're gonna skip the step of where these glucose activate these K cells, right? These GIP cells. So you're not gonna have such a great influence on insulin secretion. So that's why we always give people oral glucose, because oral glucose is the only time you stimulate the K cells, which secrete GIP, which then makes these islets of Langerhans cells dump out a shitload of insulin. Now you still get some insulin release with IV glucose, but it doesn't compare at all to the amount of insulin you get when you give oral glucose. And that's what this statement actually says on the bottom of this slide, is that IV glucose does not stimulate GIP release. So what does that look like? Here's a really good graph that shows it. This is from WashU. It says that you see that the plasma insulin concentration is increasing here over time, and you give one patient IV glucose and you give one patient oral glucose, and they kind of start the same, for the most part, but then obviously the oral glucose has a lot more insulin than the IV glucose, right? I've seen this been tested before on many of your old practice exams, so just make sure you understand this concept. Here's just his graphs that illustrate that. I think the graph I found is a lot better. But I mean, if you could read this, basically what it's saying is that, glucose removal from the blood. Who does that? Insulin, right? Insulin is the one that removes glucose from the blood. So obviously, oral glucose is going to have a faster rate at removing glucose from the blood because of the insulin release. Which one of these IV glucose compared to oral glucose? Which one has causes a greater increase of GIP? Obviously, the oral glucose. Which one causes a greater increase of plasma insulin? Like I just said, the oral glucose. This is just him saying that not only does fat and amino acids cause the CCK cells to secrete, cause the I cells to secrete CCK. This is just him saying that other things, cause the activation of these I cells, but this is relatively low yield. I mean, this is just probably like for your. I've never seen him ask this, but this is just something you have. This is just like a something to be aware of. That not only is it always by the book 100%. Only fats and amino acids activate the I cells to release CCK, right? Obviously, other things could do it too. But you definitely have to know that free fatty acids, that fats and amino acids is the number one. Definitely know that. Definitely. So now we're going into absorption here. We talked about digestion. We talked about the enzymes that are acting on our food, acting on our proteins, acting on our fats, acting on our sugars, carbohydrates. So where is absorption taking place, right? We know that digestion obviously occurs more in the duodenum. We can see that this graph shows that it goes down. Digestion kind of goes down as you go along. Absorption occurs more at the duodenum. You can see that it starts to go down as you go to the ileum. Notice that iron is absorbed the most at the duodenum, and notice that B12 is absorbed. B12 and bile acids are absorbed more at the ileum. That's a very important concept to know, where the location of absorption of iron, the location of absorption of B12, and you guys should know eventually the location of absorption of folate. And so iron, whenever you think about iron being absorbed, think duodenum. Whenever you think of folate being absorbed, think jejunum. Whenever you think about bile acids and vitamin B12 being absorbed, think ileum, right? And then this is basically This is just another diagram of this is just a diagram. I really suggest you guys kind of learn to draw it. I think when it comes to GI, I think a good way of learning GI is and mastering is just drawing, getting comfortable, drawing the stomach, drawing the first part of duodenum, drawing where those cells are, drawing these kind of pathways. That definitely will help out a lot with your studies. So this is just recapping everything, right? We talked about everything. We talked about everything in this image already. If you're having a hard time, definitely go back and check out my earlier videos. Um, Again, right here we're talking about digestion, right? We already talked about these pancreatic enzymes that are one of the main major players in digestion, right? We see that these proteases, right, the ones that digest proteins, we see trypsins there, right? And even though we already know trypsin, right? I said trypsin starts off as what? Trypsinogen, and then trypsinogen becomes what? Trypsin. Who converts it into trypsin? Enterokinases, brush border enzymes, right? And then what does trypsin do? Trypsin goes out and it starts to activate other proenzymes such as chymotrypsinogen, such as procarboxypeptidase. And then you also have so like I said, amylase is gonna do your sugars, carbohydrates. Lipase is obviously going to do your fats. Not much to know. One of the things that's interesting, I think the takeaway message from this slide is that the brush border enzymes do not include any lipases, right? Brush border enzymes do not digest fat. Brush border enzymes do not digest fat, and that's really a great segue into what we're about to talk about, actually, because at this point we're talking about absorption. So like I said, if brush border enzymes have proteins, have enzymes for proteins, brush border enzymes have enzymes for carbs, but it does not have enzymes for lipids. So we got to figure out a way how to get lipids through the brush border and into the enterocyte, right? So just to talk about, just to go into a little bit of detail here, how do carbs get digested and absorbed? The only monosaccharides, we can only absorb monosaccharides. When I say monosaccharides, I mean glucose, I mean fructose, and I mean galactose. So as you can see right here, we turn sucrase, which is a brush border enzyme, converts sucrose into one glucose and one fructose, right? We turn glucose oligomers meaning repeats of the same thing. We turn glucose oligomers into a whole bunch of glucose, individual glucose, right? And we do that via glucoamylase, right? We turn lactose into glucose and galactose, right? And the enzyme we use for that is lactase, right? And lactase is a brush border enzyme, right? And this kind of, we can talk about people with who are lactose intolerant, right? They're missing this enzyme, right? People who are lactose intolerant are missing this enzyme on their brush border, which means that they can't digest lactose, which means that lactose stays in your gut longer, which means that bacteria have a feast of sugar to eat. And bacteria, when they eat sugar, they create gas, all that kind of stuff. And those are the clinical symptoms and the pathophysiology behind people who are lactose deficient. Okay, so all of these monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose, they all can cross into the enterocyte. They can all do that, but they need they need help doing that, and I'll talk about more about that. Okay, so that's going to segue into my next slide, right? So they can all be absorbed, but they all get absorbed. The glucose and galactose get reabsorbed, specifically just those two guys, by this transporter right here, SGLT1. And you notice right here the sodium. So the S stands for sodium, G for glucose, sodium, glucose, I forget what the L stands for, but then transporter, right? And then number one is a big deal because there is a SGLT2. I think this stands for luminal, actually. So SGLT1 is a symporter. When I say symporter, that means that it imports two things into the cell, two things at the same time. What are those two things? Those two things are glucose and sodium, or galactose and sodium. That means, what I'm trying to say here, guys, is that you cannot absorb glucose or galactose without sodium. You need sodium to go inside the cell along with the monosaccharide for you to absorb it. Now, just hold that thought, because over here we see that fructose is a different story. And don't forget, all of this is the lumen over here. We're talking about the lumen. All of this is the apical side, right, of the cell. This is the apical side, right? Over here is the basolateral, right, the other side of the cell. Fructose gets absorbed into the enterocyte not through SGLT1, right? Not through SGLT1, but through GLUT5. GLUT5. So this is kind of a misnomer, right? Because this says GLUT on it, but GLUT5 is only for fructose. Fructose is imported into the cells via GLUT5, right? Now, once all of these guys get into the cell, how do they cross into the blood? Well, that one's easy. They all use GLUT2. So, there's a lot of discretions here, right? Because as I talked about here earlier, I said that all these sugars, get digested by brush border enzymes, and then over here, I'm saying that they don't all use the same doorway to get into the cell. Glucose and galactose use a sodium symporter to get into the cell called SGLT1, and fructose uses a GLUT5 to get into the cell. And then once they're inside the cell, all of them use GLUT2 to go outside the cell. High yield, guys. You guys gotta start memorizing this stuff. So GLUT5, you're only gonna find GLUT5 in two places. Only in two places. What are those two places? At the apical surface of an enterocyte. And when I say enterocyte, entero meaning the GI system, and then cyte meaning cell, right? So these enterocytes, and you'll find GLUT5 channels on them, and also on sperm cells. This is high yield step 1 stuff, and this is stuff that Dr. Littleton is teaching you right now. So definitely appreciate this information. This is definitely high yield step 1 stuff. So that kind of goes into Gatorade, right? When someone's dehydrated, you give them Gatorade. Why do you give them Gatorade? Well, to replace the electrolytes that people lose when they sweat, when they dehydrate, right? Dehydration really has nothing to do with water. Someone can have a perfectly normal volume in their human body. They can have normal volume and they'll be hydrated. They'll be dehydrated. Why? Whenever we talk about dehydration, we're talking about electrolyte imbalances, right? What is the sodium? What is the potassium? What is the chloride? That's dehydration. Dehydration, we always talk about water loss. Yeah. But don't forget, the body doesn't just lose water like that. Water follows things. Water follows sodium. Water follows all these electrolytes. So, if someone is dehydrated and you give them Gatorade, how do we absorb the sodium? What does Gatorade have to have for you to absorb the sodium? Glucose. Gatorade contains glucose in it. Why? Because remember what I said. If you have an enterocyte, in order for sodium or for glucose in that matter to get into your blood, they have to cross through a symporter. They need each other. This is why people who are dehydrated or have an electrolyte imbalance, they drink Gatorade, and this is why Gatorade has glucose. So with that background, go ahead and pause the video and answer this question. All right, we're back. So basically this question is saying, what transport protein is responsible for the entry of glucose into the intestinal enterocyte? Slam dunk here, right? the one responsible for glucose and galactose is going to be your SGLT1, right? If the question was asking you what transport protein is responsible for fructose into the enterocyte, at that point the answer would be GLUT5, right? If the question was asking you um, what what transfer protein is responsible for dumping out fructose, glucose, and galactose into the bloodstream, then the answer would be GLUT2, right? Yeah, GLUT2. You see, now I know you guys always hear me saying, "Oh, do old questions, do old questions, do old exams." This question, right here, can I just gave you 3 different ways they can answer this exact same question, the exact same concept. Um, like I said, brush border enzymes important. Enterokinase is probably the one you have to memorize. I would definitely memorize enterokinase. The reason why is because enterokinase is the enzyme that converts trypsinogen into what? Trypsin. And then what does trypsin do? Trypsin converts trypsinogen into trypsin, other trypsinogen into trypsin. It converts chymotrypsinogen into chymotrypsin. It converts all of these proenzymes, all of these zymogens into their active enzyme form. You need trypsin. If you didn't have trypsin, you'll be short. If you didn't have enterokinase to activate the trypsin in the first place, you'll be short. That's why our brush border is so important to have, because our brush border contains enterokinase, right? And then just to hammer that point in, I just redirect you to this first aid page, which is high yield, right? Trypsinogen converted to active enzyme trypsin, and then trypsin goes along and activates other proenzymes and cleaves additional trypsinogen into active trypsin, right? What converts trypsinogen into trypsin? Enterokinase, a brush border enzyme on the duodenum and jejunum. And then this is just talking about protein digestion, like protein specifically. Like I said, protein digestion begins in the stomach. Carbohydrate digestion begins in your mouth, right? Remember, we have oral amylase, but we don't digest protein in our mouth. That's why we can't taste protein. We can't taste tofu and stuff like that. So remember pepsin, Pepsi. Scientists thought that was the one responsible for gastric acid secretion. Back in the days, they were wrong. So they created Pepsi, which has bicarb to as an antacid. So pepsin is one of the ones that begins to digest proteins that happens in the stomach, and then obviously your pancreatic proteases, which are your trypsins and all the other guys. Point is that you get amino acids, and they can that we absorb those, right? We can also so digestion of protein occurs at 3 places, right? One is in the lumen of the GI, right? We know that pepsins act on the lumen, and so do pancreatic proteases, right? We also know that 2, the brush border contains peptidases, right? Okay, so we have protein digestion so far in 2 places, right? In the lumen of the GI, at the brush border, and where else? Inside the cell, inside the enterocyte. The enterocyte can turn these dipeptides and tripeptides and can digest them into amino acids. So what this slide is saying is that you have protein digestion at 3 different places in your GI tract. I think the one that people tend to forget is the second and third one, right? We probably forget that the brush border enzymes also have peptidases, and we also forget that there is a protein digestion occurring inside the cell, right? And when I say digestion, I mean that they're making these proteins smaller, into their amino acid form. And then this is just a slide saying how exactly protein absorption happens, right? These dipeptides and tripeptides act on the hydrogen ion symporter for that to happen. They also, once inside the cell, like I said, they are attacked by, enzymes inside the cell, cytoplasmic enzymes, to be specific, cytoplasmic peptidases, right? That convert them into amino acids. And they can also just, skip that part too and just go straight to the blood. Straight to the blood. And just to touch on pancreatic lipases, right? This is where the money is, right? Because we all like fatty food. We all eat fatty food, French fries, all that kind of stuff. And then so our enzymes in our pancreas are one of the top dogs in charge of breaking down that stuff to make us absorb it. And how does it work? Well, right here we have a molecule of triglyceride, right? We have a molecule of triglyceride, and then we have pancreatic lipase. Pancreatic lipase is going to approach that molecule of triglyceride and bow, attack it there, and also bow, attack it there. So then that way we end up with one free fatty acid, two free fatty acids, and we end up with a 2 monoglyceride molecule. Now, people get confused all the time because in text when you're reading it, you would see the number 2 on there. That number 2 represents the carbon number of where this free fatty acid is attached to, right? It's attached to the second carbon. That's why the number 2 is there. So, don't forget, one triglyceride becomes 2 free fatty acids, and it becomes 1 2 monoglyceride, right? You just have one of these, not two of them, just one of them, right? So you get a total of 3 products. Just something like test makers love playing on this number, the fact that there's number 2 there to confuse you. I found a few images online that are pretty clutch in kind of explaining pancreatic lipase. Like I said, you take a triglyceride, right? Triglyceride is attached to this 3 carbon backbone, right? It converts it into a 2 monoglyceride, 2 because of the second carbon, and you get 2 free fatty acids. Here's just another diagram that shows that. You have the triglyceride, you have the 3 carbon backbone. The pancreatic lipase acts on it using water, and you get the 2 monoglyceride, 2 for the second carbon, the 2 carbon backbone, right? Carbon backbone was here. I'm sorry, and then you get a total of 2 free fatty acids. And this is just an example. So, like I said, fats, are they water soluble? No. Unfortunately, we can only absorb water soluble things. And we know that fatty acids are insoluble, right? They're insoluble in water, they're soluble in fat, but they're insoluble in water. So we have a problem here, right? We have a problem because our gut can only absorb things that are attached to water or are water loving, right? Hydrophilic. I'm not sure if I'm spelling that right. So hydro meaning water, and then philic is like some Latin for loving. So we can only absorb water loving things, and unfortunately fat is hydrophobic, right? Water hating. So how do we absorb fat? What's the mechanism behind that? The way that happens is through micelles. Specifically mixed micelles, right? So obviously, we're going to have these lipases that are going to act on this huge glob of oil, right? This huge glob of fat is going to be broken down into smaller fats. And we right here, you can see that there's bile acid. So this bile acid is going to attach to these smaller little bits of fat, and it's going to form these things called mixed micelles. The thing about bile acid is that bile acid is water soluble. So as you can see right here, the bile acid starts to make a circle around this fat stuff. It makes a circle around this fatty stuff. And then just here's basically how and by forming this circle, the outside of the circle is soluble in water, while the inside of the circle where all this fat is insoluble in water, right? It's hydrophobic. The outside is hydrophilic, the inside is hydrophobic. And then just here's a great diagram of a micelle, how it works. Basically, the concept is this: the outside is hydrophilic, and the inside is hydrophobic. So when we talk about, and here's just a better picture of a micelle. So this is just a simple micelle. This is a really plain micelle. This is a micelle if you in the laboratory, right? You have the hydrophilic end, and then you have the hydrophobic end, and then you can see the water is out here. So obviously the hydrophilic end is going to be outside, while the hydrophobic end stays inside. So that's how we get a mixed micelle. So the polar end, which is the water-soluble end, is going to be composed of bile acids, right? And then the non-polar end, which is going to make the inside of the micelle, is going to be, have your cholesterol, it's going to have your fat, and it's going to look like this. This is basically what a mixed micelle looks like, right? The bile salt, which is water soluble, is going to make the majority outside of the mixed micelle, while the inside, where the water insoluble content is, your fat, is going to stay inside. Now, once you have the micelle is going to diffuse across. So these are going to diffuse across with the micelle. Once they get inside, they're going to, the free fatty acids and the 2-monoglyceride are going to come together again to form triglycerides, and then the triglycerides are going to be packaged up in the smoothie R through and packaged up into chylomicrons, and then these chylomicrons are going to be dumped out into lacteals, which is your lymphatic system, right? And then your lymphatic system is going to go into your veins and dump into your veins, and that's how you get fat to go into your blood. So you guys are probably wondering, okay, Andrei, you're telling me that we digested triglycerides. We digested them into monoglycerides and free fatty acids. We packaged them inside into micelles, and then those micelles come inside the cell, and then we unpackage the micelle, and then we grab the free fatty acids and the monoglycerides and make triglyceride just to package that and send that out into the lymphatic system. Why can't triglyceride just go inside directly? That's not how it works. I'm sorry, that's just not how it works. It doesn't make sense. I know it doesn't, but I like to think of it this way. And this is how you need to think about it. This is how you guys should think about when it comes to fat absorption. Is that, let's say you're moving, right? You guys moved here to your dorms or wherever you live to Howard, right? So here's your house. In order for you to move from your house to where you're staying at, the new place where you're staying at, you had to package all your stuff into smaller boxes. Then you package all the things in your house into smaller boxes, and then you move it into your new place, and then you unpack it, and then you're in a new place. So that's how fat works, right? You break down fat into smaller things, then you absorb those smaller things, and then you build the fat again once it's inside your system. I know it's weird, right? High yield thing here though is that people always forget, even my classmates forget, that fat gets dumped into your lacteals first, into your lymphatic system first, and the lymphatics they ultimately drain into your veins. That's how we get fat. Here's just a good image I found online that kind of sums up how we absorb fat. So again, like I said, we start off with fatty acids and triglycerides first, and then those get broken down. You make the micelles, right? Those get broken down, aka emulsified. Emotion or emulsification is just a fancy term that says you increase the surface area. So they turn this one circle into many little small circles, right? And basically what you're doing is increasing the surface area, right? So what happens is that these fatty acids and monoglycerides get packaged up into micelles, and then these micelles, these micelles keeps them into the lumen, and then that fat goes into the cell, and then it gets packaged up in the Golgi. So I misspoke. I said smoothie R earlier. It's really the Golgi. It gets packaged up into these chylomicrons, and then the chylomicrons are dumped out into the lymphatics, also known as lacteals. So with that background, let's go ahead and do this question. All right, so the question is asking, a morbidly obese male presents with hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and type 2 diabetes. Dietary fat, after being processed, is extruded from the mucosal cells of the GI tract into lymphatic ducts in the form of which of the following? The answer here is a chylomicrons, right? If we were to rewind this question a little bit, and the question were to ask you that what makes the lipids soluble in the GI, then we're talking about micelles. We would be talking about micelles right there. If the question were to ask you what is the breakdown products of triglycerides? What is one of them? The answer there would be monoglycerides, right? Do we get diglycerides? No. We get, remember, you have the 3-carbon backbone. This triglyceride becomes a 2-monoglyceride, and then it becomes 2 free fatty acids. All right, so this is just another one of how GI is regulated. So fat in the ileum and fat inside the ileum and colon release peptide YY, which is basically going to inhibit you from eating. It's going to stop GI functions, right? It's going to inhibit meal stimulated functions, right? So this is how we turn it off, right? So once your fat gets to the ileum, which is the last part of your small intestine, and then obviously once fat gets into your colon, at that point you're like almost toward the end of digestion. So how do we turn digestion off? We're going to secrete PYY. And what that does is turn everything off, right? It's going to decrease gastric acid secretion. It's going to decrease gastric emptying, decrease the pancreas, decrease the transit rate, and decrease colon motility, right? So it's whenever you think of peptide YY, think about somatostatin, right? It works the same way, right? Somatostatin turns everything off. And then here's just going back to Dr. Littleton's. We have peptide YY down here. And as you can see, what activates it is fats in the lumen, in the ileum and colon. And what it does is basically turn everything off. So now we're going to go into what, so like I said, vitamin absorption so these are water-soluble vitamins, right? We're talking about water-soluble vitamins. Can you guys tell me what the fat-soluble vitamins are? Whenever I think about fat-soluble vitamins, the way I memorize them is DEAK. Your fat-soluble vitamins are vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin A, and vitamin K, which means that your water-soluble vitamins include vitamin B and vitamin C. Vitamin C is this one right here, ascorbic acid, right? That's vitamin C. Can anybody tell me what happens when you have low vitamin C in your diet? Yeah, you get scurvy. A little prior knowledge there, right? So then vitamin B, you have a shit ton of those. There's vitamin B1, vitamin B2, vitamin B3, all that kind of stuff, right? So vitamin B12 is really important because vitamin B12 is also known as cobalamin. Cobalamin, and vitamin B12 is absorbed in the ileum. And vitamin B12 is really important. Guys, get familiar with this. Actually, it's important because I mean he even mentions it over here in that earlier slide. If you guys remember this one over here, let me find it. Over here, right? He talks about where does vitamin B12 get absorbed in the ileum. Where does iron get absorbed in the duodenum? A really great mnemonic for absorption of iron, folate, and vitamin B12 is this: is iron first, bro. Iron first, bro. Because you have DJI, Dow Jones Index is how I memorize the small intestine. So iron gets absorbed in the duodenum, folate gets absorbed in the jejunum, and vitamin B12 gets absorbed in the ileum. So like I said, just understand. I think if you're gonna get tested on something, it will be this one. Patient comes in, their ileum was removed. What is the person at risk of? Vitamin B12 deficiency. That's simple. This is just a really busy slide that's just saying that water drives a lot of absorption. I mean, we absorb a lot of water in our GI, right? We know that. And water is solute driven. So as we absorb these nutrients, sodium, glucose, all these kind of things, we also absorb water. And he's going to talk about exactly how water works. So let's say we consume 1.5 liters of water. That's going to distend our stomach, obviously, and then we're going to get secretions from our GI. The saliva is going to, let's say the saliva, dumps out, okay, every day, right? Every day we make a bunch of saliva. It's like 1.5 liters. Our stomach throughout the day dumps out a whole bunch of stuff, 2.5 liters. Bowels, 500 milliliters. Pancreas, 1.5 liters. Intestine, 1 liter. So you get a total of about 7,000 milliliters or 7 liters from the stomach, from the GI system alone. So you get a total of 8,500. At the end of the day, you get 200 milliliters of stuff in your stool. That doesn't make sense because you guys are probably wondering, wait a minute. You're telling me that at some point we consume 1.5 liters, and out of that 1.5 liters, what we end up taking out is 200 milliliters. Yeah, the reason why is because the GI tract absorbs almost all of the water, and then water is a lot of stuff that we eat. So this is really high yield. I remember in high school and in college, people always saying, "Oh, the colon is where water absorption happens. The colon is where most of the water absorption happens." That's kind of a lie. As you can see right here, right? If we start off with 8,500 milliliters of a total, this is including food. This is including all the crazy stuff your GI dumps into your lumen to digest the food. We can see that 500 milliliters of water is absorbed in the duodenum and jejunum. 5,000 milliliters, right? 5,000 milliliters. So then we're left with 3,500 out of that 8,500, right? Then 1,300 is reabsorbed in the ileum, right? So now we're left with 2,200. And then we absorb 2,000 in the colon so that we can end up with the 200 in our stool. So up until now, I'm sure many of you guys have heard that the colon is your major site for water absorption. And that's technically false. Because as you can see here, by the time you get to the colon, you have 2,200 milliliters. Of that 2,200 milliliters, 2,000 gets absorbed. So 2,000 over 2,200 is about 90%. We have 90% occurring in the colon. 5 days.